on board for the first time as the festival's associate partner. Our venue partners Rajain Kilachan and Bank of Baroda. JCB Prize for Literature Bookstore managed by Full Circle. Our cause partner Dettol, Banega Swachh India. Black and White, our celebrations partner. Thank you to Jan Mishlaski, Aga Khan Foundation, Getty Foundation, J. Paul Getty Trust, British Council, Nordic Lights, Mahindra World City Jaipur, Dove, Airtel, Kingfisher, Grover, CK Birla Hospitals, Avid Learning for believing in the festival and continuing support. New partners this year are the Population Foundation of India, Child Labour Free Jaipur Initiative, DMI Finance, Dell, Sun Village, Air India, Ola, O2 Sparkle, and Swami. Our publishers, Penguin, MIT Press, Westland, Oxford Dictionaries, Murthy Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press, and HarperCollins. We would also like to thank our media partners, Red FM and Rajasthan's very own Patrika Group and Bhaskar Group for their generous support year after year. Our new partners, Business Standard, Outlook, and DNA. Our social media partners deserve a mention, Facebook and Twitter, who increase our reach to the world. Vayus, Wattpad, and Launchora, our podcast partner. The first session at Charbagh will begin shortly. We are delighted to introduce the first session for today, which is session number 112 after Bloodhead, sponsored by the J. Paul Getty Trust series. We have with us Mark Quinn. He entered the international art scene in 1991 with his celebrated Frozen self-portrait series made of his own blood titled Self. He talks about his life and inspiration as well as his upcoming projects in conversation with an awarded artist and writer, Molly Crabapple. Please give a big round of applause for Mark Quinn and Molly Crabapple.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Does this work? Yeah.
I think it does work. So you've already got an amazing introduction to Mark Quinn, a legendary young British artist and the creator of Blood Cube, a public artwork about the refugee crisis, which he'll speak about. My name is Molly Crabapple. I am an artist and a journalist who has covered refugee issues for the last 6 years in Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Greece. And my most recent book was Brothers of the Gun with the Syrian journalist Marwan Hisham. First, we're going to do a bit of a retrospective of your career, yeah?
I don't, if this works.
If
yeah.
it works? Does it work?
No.
No.
Oh, this where?
That's it.
Towards the blue tent. No.
No.
There's a whole lot of guys up there, but they're not reacting to my
Yeah,
press of the button.
I don't know. The air is not transmitting this.
Oh, there's something.
There it is.
Okay.
So Mark, this is the piece that, though it's not titled Bloodhead, this is the
It's called
first
Self, yeah.
Self. It's the first piece that you did in your own blood. Would you like to speak about it a bit, and also about why you decided to do it in blood?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sculpture. Is there another? No. It's a sculpture that's made from a mold of my head, and then I went to the doctor for a year and took all the blood out of my body, gradually. And then I poured the blood into the mold, and it's displayed in a freezer cabinet. So while the freezer's plugged in, the sculpture looks like this. If there's a power cut or you unplug it, it turns to a pool of blood. So it's a sculpture that exists only on life support. A bit like us, really. I mean, it's dependent sculpture. It's dependent on infrastructure. It's dependent on people coming together and creating society. So it's really was about how the self, ourselves, are not really independent, that we're all connected to everything, amongst many other things. It's an ongoing series. I make one every 5 years. So there's 6 of them now. This first is the first one, and this was shown in the Saatchi collection in London. It's now in New York. It's been frozen for 25 years.
And what's the attraction of working in blood for you?
Well, it was really about getting rid of, as an artist, the idea of getting rid of all barriers between myself and reality, or the subject. And I was just thinking, portrait's so kind of boring and illustrational, and like, why can't you make something, like, I want to bring real life into art. Why can't I make something out of a person? Mm-hmm. And then without killing myself as well, and without chopping my arm off or something. And then it just came to me that blood is this amazing material that can be seen as both positive and negative. It's about death and about life. Your body recreates it, so it's almost like a resource that your body creates. And I could take it out, and my body remade more of it. So now there's 6 of these sculptures, so there's 60 pints of my blood in the world, plus the 10 that are going around me. So in a way, the sculpture is really about life and the amazing way that the human body reproduces itself and how life reproduces itself.
And the way that blood is the thing that connects all of us and that we all have, even though it's
exactly.
Another way that people have segmented each other from each other.
Of course.
I was thinking of, when I was researching your talk, I was thinking of the limpieza de sangre laws in Spain. They were the laws that Ferdinand and Isabella did after 1492 when they expelled the Jews.
Yeah.
Which, limpieza de sangre, if you don't know Spanish, it means cleanliness of the blood. And
means what?
Cleanliness of the blood.
Oh, yeah.
And it meant that you had to prove that you had no Jewish or Muslim ancestry to have the full rights of Spanish citizenship. And I think...
That must have been quite difficult since there was...
Genealogy.
Genealogy. Well, they didn't have DNA sequencing, did they?
No, they didn't. So I think that blood is a fascinating
it's all prejudice,
thing.
which is what we know it all is anyway.
Exactly. So your next piece in this show, it's one of your series of these beautiful marble sculptures you've done of disabled models.
Yeah. Let me just... So kind of after doing something about myself, I thought it was interesting to move on to do other people, but I wasn't really thinking, and it's interesting how the idea for this came up. I was visiting the British, I always love ancient art museums. I was in the British Museum. I was at the Louvre looking at these sculptures of fragmented statues, and all the people going, oh, the Mona Lisa is the most beautiful sculpture of a woman, or I love the argument. And I was thinking, why do people like broken things? And it's obviously about nostalgia. It's a lost golden age. It's this idea of the past being more perfect. And then I thought, but wait a second, if you have someone whose real body is the same shape as those artworks, I don't think the reaction is going to be the same, but I don't know what's going to happen. So I thought, I kind of said, well, to myself, why don't I find some Paralympic athletes who are incredibly fit, but they have lost their limbs through accident or illness or birth, and why don't I just make a marble sculpture out of them and see what happens? see what the artwork tells me, because I don't know any good artwork that I make. I don't know what it's going to be until I make it. Otherwise, there's no point in making it. It's a voyage of discovery, as you know.
Yes.
And so when I made them, they became incredibly puzzling and interesting, because on one hand, they're taking the neoclassical ideal because they're kind of perfectly carved, and yet they're neoclassical sculptures of the kind of bodies that aren't normally celebrated in our society. And then also, they appear to be fragmentary, but of course they're not, they're a whole person. So lots of really interesting ideas started to move around within that.
And for people in the audience who are not sculptors, walk us through how you do a sculpture like that. How do you create it?
Well, to make these sculptures, it's different in every one, but for these ones, I made some life casts from the sitters, so they came to my studio. I made some molds from them, and then I worked with craftsmen in Italy, in Pietrasanta, which is an amazing town, which is a whole town where everyone carves marble. So you go to any yard and it's full of people carving marble, people who've been doing it since they were 12, you know, men and women who are just like geniuses of craft. And so I collaborate with them, and with a pointing machine, they worked from the sculpture I made and carved it in marble, and I would go down every week or two and sort of say, you know, this bit should be more like that. And it's a process this collaborative process of making art has happened since antiquity. I mean, all ancient sculptures are made like that, all Rodin's made like that. And it's not something that people know. I mean, people who know about art know, but it's kind of interesting.
Hold it a little bit closer to your mouth. You should hold the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth.
Closer to mouth,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I forgot what you asked me now.
What was the reaction like from the disabled community when you first exhibited these sculptures?
It was incredibly positive. And everyone, I mean, the way I did it is the sculpture, the pictures we just looked at, the one person on the right, Peter Hull, was the first person. So I just made a sculpture of Peter first. And then once I'd had Peter's sculpture, I was then able to show it to all the other potential sitters, and they were all like, yeah, I'll do it. And then there was a competition for the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in London, which is this public sculpture competition. And so I created a proposal to have a sculpture of an artist and disabled woman called Alison Lapper, who was one of my original list of people for the other project, but it didn't work out because she couldn't do it, she wasn't feeling well. And then when it came to do this, it turned out that Alison was pregnant. So I made a sculpture of Alison pregnant, and I made a sculpture of Alison pregnant 3.5 meters high, which was in Trafalgar Square. And that really did have an impact on how people thought about disabled people, and it also woke me up to content in public art, because people would walk through Trafalgar Square, people who didn't know anything about art, people who just go into the office or tourists, and they're confronted with this image, and you have to make some kind of sense from it. And by doing that, you make people feel and you make people think, and you make people look at art who may not even think they're interested in art. So I kind of think that content in public realm is really important.
The first piece of yours that I saw was a golden statue of one of my very dear and old friends, a transgender porn star and sex educator named Buck Angel.
Yeah.
And when I first saw that, it was such an accurate representation of who he is. I think that was what drew me to it, even though it was in this like very glorified, deified, I mean, you know, gold, right, medium.
Bronze, yeah, but it looks golden, yeah.
It looks gold. So,
Yeah.
And I was thinking, how do you collaborate with your models when you're doing these sort of portraits? Because it seems quite close.
Yeah, I mean, I usually sort of meet with a person, hang out, talk to them, and then it sort of comes from that. It's from what I have an initial idea, and then it always changes when I meet the person. So it's a kind of, sort of that's how it works.
What's that one?
Oh, this is the so when the Paralympics happened, they asked me if they could put the Alison Lapper sculpture in the opening ceremony, And then it seemed to me like, well, it's made of marble. It's 3.5 meters, which looks big in Trafalgar Square, will look tiny in the Olympic Stadium, and it would be impossible to bring in and out, which is what they wanted. So then I looked at inflatables. And so for technical reasons, we looked at making inflatable sculpture. So they scanned the marble one, and then they made it out of this fabric, which then has air being blown into it. But what was really interesting is it became a much more human object at that point. It was this colossal, breathing, living thing. And when you touched the skin, it was soft. It just became it became really quite interesting evolution of the coldness of the marble into the warmth of a living breath. And the sculpture is called Breath.
And so massive, like some sort of living goddess.
Yes, exactly. And so that was a thing interesting, because it's where technical circumstance actually makes you take the idea further into a different place that I wouldn't have thought of before.
So where has your work gone since these sculptures?
Well, I mean, let me see, I don't know what. Well, I mean, this is another kind of abstract portrait. The portraits of, I'm interested in where abstraction and figuration meet. And so, and in a post 9/11 world where you go to the airport and your eyes are scanned, your fingerprints scanned. So it's like abstract identity. So I started making paintings of people's irises. So this is called We Share Our Chemistry with the Stars, this series. So it's the idea that, it's kind of the beginning of the idea of bringing, of a common humanity, I suppose. That when you do a picture of someone's iris, you don't know who they are, you know nothing about their social standing, anything. You just have to look at them as a human presence. So that's the positive side of it. The other side of it is control by governments and things. And then I did fingerprints as well. So again, this kind of idea of identity residing in like a barcode or an abstraction. And so more different ways of looking at identity, I suppose.
Well, it's very interesting because it's identity as illegible to a human. A human can't recognize another from a fingerprint, but legible to a machine.
Exactly, which is kind of like abstract. So our figuration has been abstracted.
Exactly, we've been made readable by algorithms and biometric databases, and increasingly unreadable to ourselves.
Yeah, when you look at a fingerprint picture, you don't know who it is. But as you say, a scanner does.
Exactly.
So that's kind of interesting.
How do you get around the sort of surveillance of irises? Can you put on contact lenses of different irises now?
I mean, I think you could, but then you wouldn't get through your airport if they have that. But they don't seem to have it so much anymore. It's now fingerprints and photographs. There was a time in Britain when it was irises, and that's now stopped. But I think it's still being used for other things. Should we look at what's next? Oh, this is a meat painting. So this is a journey into the inside of the body. So again, it kind of like an abstract painting, like a de Kooning or something like this. But it's actually a photograph of lamb that I bought in the butcher's shop and like chopped up and then took a picture of it and then made a painting of it. And this is sort of, I think, about 3 meters by 4 meters. So it's like you're suddenly injected into the inside of a body in this kind of oval, but it's also got this kind of oceanic sort of feel, and it's kind of beautiful and disgusting at the same time, which I love.
Well, it's all the things that we see every day, but because you're seeing them up close, they're stripped of their meaning, and it gives us a chance to make a new meaning with them.
Yeah, and it is that thing of, I like things that are ambivalent, that are paradoxical, that seem to be one thing and in fact are the other, or that go between, because I think then you don't get bored of things, because your mind can never resolve the conundrum in a sense. You're always drawn to it and repulsed to it, or in this case, or made to think about what flesh is, and that we're made of flesh and animals are made of flesh, and all these questions that we don't really want to think about. But on the other hand, also it's a beautiful painting and it's lovely to look at. So it's kind of, I think the more contradictions in a work of art, the more interesting it is.
So the loveliness, and then once you think about the lovely red patterns that you're looking at, all the discomfort and horror and awareness of your own mortality.
Yeah, and the discomfort and horror of the animal that grew into this and that ended up in a butcher shop. Let's see what's next. And this is some of the artwork I made with DNA. So around the turn of the millennium, I started working with Sir John Solston, who's one of the people who sequenced the human genome for the public part of it. So there was this race between Craig Venter, who wanted to privatize our genomes, and the public guys who were sequencing it. It was actually an amazingly important race, because it's like, does the instructions to make our cells belong to everyone, or does it belong to a commercial company? It's like almost like the epitome of Big Brother or sort of corporate baddiness. And luckily, the public attempt to do it won and beat Venter by a time, and then they just published the whole genome, and it became available to any scientist, to anyone who wanted to research it. And a lot of genetics in medicine, all that has come from this. And so John was one of the people doing that. And I started working in his lab and making artworks using DNA. And the one we just looked at is like, it's the Garden of Eden. So it has the DNA of, I think, 127 different plants, and a human man, a human woman. So it's almost like a kind of sci-fi version of the traditional Garden of Eden painting. It's just got all the instructions to remake it.
And what do you think of what's happening now, where instead of our DNA being sequenced and privatized, it's our thoughts and feelings and our social interactions, and how long our mouse lingers over something, and what diseases we search, and what porn we like, and literally every single thing from our pupil dilation to our greatest fears and desires? I mean, that's what's happening with the network and with smartphones.
But like any drug,
yes,
because you're so seduced by all the good things, or all the things it can give you, you just think that doesn't matter.
Do you think you could make art out of the abstract patterns of our desires?
I think that would be quite interesting. I haven't thought about it, but I think that should be my new project. But
I'm good at giving inspiration.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad to be inspired in this talk. But I think it is, I think that an artist should be inspired by the world, and I think very much by the world we live in. It's about reflecting the world. You and I live now. There's certain things happening now that can never happen to someone in the past or in the future. And when we look back at art in the past, what's beautiful about it is that it's so of its time, but also timeless and can still talk to us. So it's this idea of somehow you have to incarnate your time and something that's eternal in the humans, and then it can then art becomes this kind of spiritual time machine that if you go to a temple here and you look at an amazing sculpture done 1,000 years ago, you're still right there, even if you may know nothing about, if I may know nothing about the religious context of it, I'm there with the artist who made it, and there's a communication with someone who's died 1,000 years ago, and there's a moment that's still in the present moment. I think that's the difference between art and artifact, is that art always lives in the present moment. So great art, whatever it is made, is always now. And an artifact is something that stays literally in the rearview mirror of history. It just sort of stays where it was and doesn't. So bad art lives in the past, good art lives now.
I might problematize that a bit. I might disagree with you. I think that whether or not something leaps out and grabs you or not depends a lot on you. I look at
it changes all the time.
The ukiyo-e floating world prints, from Japan that were so little valued that they were used to wrap up stuff that people were buying from Japan, and then they came to Europe and inspired Toulouse-Lautrec and a generation of post-impressionists. I once had a friend, an extraordinary artist. He told me that the way that you know art is that it's still recognizable as art if you see it in a tag sale. Not just in a fancy white gallery, right,
Yeah.
surrounded by a shell of money, but you see it everywhere. And I think that's what you're saying too about
Yeah.
the sculptures in the temple.
But also, the other thing is that what we're interested in changes. I mean, there are things that you can acknowledge are great art, but you're not that interested in. So, I mean, defining things is always slightly a waste of time. I don't know. It's
for critics who need jobs, not for artists who make things.
Yeah, but somehow it's kind of an interesting game in some way. Not game, but it's because I suppose when you're making art, you're trying to define it by making it, in a way, aren't you?
I think we're just trying to make things so that we could keep ourselves alive in this world, and then other people slap the definitions on them.
Exactly.
And then we have to go along with that so we can keep making money.
Yeah. What's the next thing? So these sculptures are from the... So after I made the sculpture of disabled people, I got really interested in, and this is where the Buck Angel sculpture is part of this series, of people who actually changed their body, and how nowadays you can have an internal vision of yourself, and you can actually externalize it and sort of become the person that you want to be. And the first time in human history, really, because of drugs and surgery and things, you can actually transform your body from a man to a woman, or you can tattoo yourself, you can do scarification, you can do all these things and become your own vision of yourself biologically as well as dressing in different clothing. So it seemed really interesting, and I felt also that people who do this are artists in themselves, and that when I make a sculpture of like Bach, for instance, it's a collaboration with him, really, that it's sort of, he's an artist who's taken his own body as his medium. And I think that's what was interesting, even if unconsciously, even if the people like Chelsea Charms or Thomas Beattie here might not call themselves artists, I would say they are a kind of performance artists in some way. In my head, I wouldn't impose that on them, but that's how I think about people. And it was quite interesting to make these kind of futuristic sculptures about now, but in a quite traditional medium of marble and this sort of timeless classicism. And I did this show in 2010, and everyone was like, oh, this is just you're just trying to be provocative and do freaky stuff. And I was like, no, this is the way the future is. And it seems like that now that is kind of really where we are in many ways.
Especially the breaking down of the gender binary.
Yeah.
The way that you have her, she's like cradling her breasts almost like a Madonna would cradle a child, but she's cradling her own self-creation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's so interesting. And I think I obviously never judge anyone that I work with. I try and enable them to be themselves in them and to kind of express something that they are and give them dignity and in the artwork. And I think it's kind of it's sort of about now in some way, and about recording now for the future, but also just sort of changing. I've sort of lost my path, but kind of what I said before.
So tell me about the work that we're sort of here for, which is Blood Cube.
Yeah. Shall I find a picture of that? Okay, so this is a work that I'm working on now, which is a sculpture that's inspired by the refugee crisis. And it's a sculpture sort of about refugees, made with the collaboration of 5,000, at least 5,000, probably more people. Half of them are refugees and half of them are non-refugees. And it's a public artwork, so it follows after the Alison Lapper sculpture in many ways. Its first incarnation will be in New York, in front of the New York Public Library, which this is a montage of. And so what you see is there's a couple of elements to the thing. The first one is you see this pavilion designed by Norman Foster, which has this kind of tent-like quality, and inside it are these two cubes, which are meter cubes, so they're 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, each weighing a ton, and each cube is made of frozen human blood. So it's the first time I've used blood since Self. And one is made of donations by settled refugees who have been settled into Western countries, and one is made by donations of people who are not directly refugees or don't see themselves as refugees. So you have this solidarity between the two objects and the two groups of people. They're not labeled. You can't tell which is which. They're like these kind of DNA libraries, which in this context of being in front of the New York Public Library is really interesting. All their ancestors are in these plots. All these people are together from every religion, from every race, from every country and ideology. And it's almost like they're kind of, in one way, crushed together, like perhaps people in some of those boats we saw in 2015, but also come together to make this incredibly solid block. And yet, of course, the solid block is only frozen because it's plugged in. So again, this idea that was in Self of dependence on infrastructure and dependence on other people to make things kind of solid and be there, is there there's a kind of contingent solidity about them. They're there, but only if you have it plugged in. And then the second part of it is that each person who gives blood also, I've filmed them talking about whatever they like. And those films will pop up around the city on bus shelters, on billboards, on any kind of moving image screen, and with subtitles. So you'll be able to hear the stories of the people who are involved in the artwork too, or any part of the story they want to tell. I mean, I've got one. Should we play I think there's this selection coming up. Oh, is there any volume on this? Is there no sound on this?
I just want to live peaceful with my child.
Let's go back. Let's start
I
again.
feel this is the opportunity for us to unite as a species.
I just want to live peaceful with my child here. I want to help my child to see him make everything he likes.
It's hard to move to a country that you're not so familiar with, but have to basically adapt and adjust to the culture.
I was in a playground with my sister, and the bomb take my brother.
I saw videos of people who I know being thrown from high buildings.
They just kill people for no reason.
I got thrown in prison and I got tortured.
When you drive your car next to a tank, this is not a normal life.
The road was like a very big black hole.
I was not aware that our parents were sending us away literally forever.
We landed in the prison.
We waited 3 days and 3 nights in the jungle for the boat to arrive. Water, food, everything ran out.
It was stormy and it capsized our boats.
When my boat started sinking, I freaked out myself and I was like, am I going to be one of them? Am I going to be a number?
And I remember, asking God, I don't want to die here, not in the middle of the sea, not now.
My blood and your blood.
It's the same.
My heart was breaking because the minute I looked at their faces, I saw the faces of my family. My grandpa Max and my grandma Celia, who fled the pogroms in Eastern Europe.
We came from bad situation. We didn't decide it. The bad situation come to us.
Imagine living without your family, where you know nobody. You don't know the language, nothing.
Understanding just how difficult that is, that it's far more difficult for them to join a new culture than it is for a culture to accept refugees.
I still have that memory of my family in front of the house saying goodbye to me.
This is a pain that is unimaginable.
My blood and refugee blood is the same.
If America had closed its doors to the Irish during the famine 150 years ago, I wonder
what would have been our fate?
There are some things that are actually basic human rights that should be provided to everyone. And a place that is safe is the most fundamental of those human rights.
The first time I heard about the project, I became so excited.
It was horrific to think about blood even. Till now, like, till I heard about the project, I thought, no, blood can help also. I shouldn't be afraid of blood.
The idea of giving blood is very poignant and meaningful.
To give your own blood, your lifeblood, it's in a sense culture blind and color blind.
It's empowering. You realize something together and it can change the world.
When I lost my brother, there was a lot of blood. Blood can be also alive or dead.
I think there's something very potent about this concept that's going to move people when they see it.
It gives you hope, you know?
Art can raise issues of equality, non-equality. That has to be one of the functions of art.
People don't get it. People don't get that refugees are normal human beings.
Then comes a project which gives these two blood together to show how we are the same, how we are equal, how we are one.
My blood and refugee blood is the same.
Under the skin, get the same.
So as you know, it's a huge topic, and there's so many different ways of looking at it, and there's so many different aspects of it. And I think it's about equality as well. It's about equality of voice, equality of things. And what you said earlier when we were talking, that it's about just, the real problem is just people not being allowed to move, and you wouldn't need to have all this if you could just get on a plane and fly somewhere.
Exactly. As I'm sure most of the people in the audience are intimately acquainted with, when they try to travel, one of the greatest inequities in our world is between people who have passports that allow them to move to most countries without visas and people who don't. There are two reasons that there are a refugee crisis. The first is the push factor, right? You know, the wars, the persecutions, the poverty in the countries that people are fleeing from. But the reason that people are drowning on boats or that they're dying in trucks in Europe is because they're not allowed to buy plane tickets. Because we live in a world where if you have a passport from a poor country, you cannot move with the same ease that I as an American or Mark as a British person can move. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because so often work about refugees, it's like apolitical, right? We were talking about this. It's just about feeling bad for poor people who suffered. How does your work challenge the idea of borders?
Well, I think the first thing is that everyone involved in it is contributing and is trying to help someone else. So whether you're a refugee donor or a non-refugee donor, you're giving your blood for this project. By giving blood, it's almost like a primordial thing about helping people. And I don't know about, in the UK, when you give blood, you don't get paid for it. In America, you get paid for it. When you give blood without getting paid for it, there's a kind of purity to the donation, and there's a feeling that the person gets, which you don't get. And you get a different way, economy of blood, I suppose, is how you look at it. In America, you have people who are very poor, who go and give blood too many times because they want money for it, and it becomes a horrible dependency. And when I first had the project, I went to Berlin and arranged a group of refugees from all different countries and talked about the project and said, you know, would you like to be paid for contributing, and how do you think this should be structured? And everyone came back and said, no, we definitely don't want to be paid, because we want to have that sense of being able to give and being able to help. Because where people have been stripped of everything, who are stripped of agency, who are stripped of being able to do anything, have become victims, been told they're victims, and now we're not. Now we're people who are helping other people like ourselves. And so that was an incredibly powerful moment. And I felt then that there's this equality of donation, there's equality of voices, that the people speaking who are refugees, non-refugees, both have the same opportunity to talk. And also another equality is looking at the equality of how come some people who are incredibly famous are so valued by society. And then some people, like refugees, are so unvalued. And I wanted to sort of put them on the same level. And blood is such a common denominator. You know, you and I and everyone in the audience has the same blood. And it's only by denying that that you can actually, and when you think about that, then you have to think about people in a different way. And interestingly, one of the refugee advocates from Chile was saying when she was being tortured in a Chilean prison by a female guard, at one point she said to her, look, you know, we have the same organs, we have the same blood in ourselves. Why are you doing this? And the policewoman had said to her, no, we don't. And you have, you get pushed to this absurd, or not absurd, actually pretty confessional point of denying your own humanity in order to harm someone else. So if you can bring back this common humanity without it being some soppy we are the world kind of thing, with keeping it real and keeping it visceral, I think that that can give us a starting point to think and in a different way. And this is obviously a not-for-profit project, so it's raising money, and I think almost probably more important, raising awareness as well for, and creating debate, and having people talk about it, and having, again, artwork in the public realm that can make someone who doesn't give a shit about art and someone who doesn't give a shit about refugees perhaps think about it, perhaps change their mind, perhaps not, but at least get to a point where they have to think about it. And I think that, you know, I think that art can change the world. And I think that as an artist, it's my responsibility to make art that has the possibility of changing people's way they think. Because really, art is about all of us. It's about human connection. That's all it's about. It's about communication. It's a form of communication and a form of memory of what people were thinking at the time, and a form of transcendence and spirituality. But it's really about people. Art is about other people.
One of the explicit aims of Blood Cube is to help refugees by raising money for the International Rescue Committee and for other refugee aid charities. Now, when I originally heard about this project, I've spent a lot of time doing journalism in refugee camps. And one of the first things you realize when you're in a refugee camp is that there's a huge structure of people making money off of refugees, of which I very much include myself as a journalist in it. There is the government that's getting money to host the refugees. There are the NGOs that are collecting salaries, right, to help refugees. There are the smugglers that are getting money to take the refugees out of the camp. There are the journalists and the artists and the people chronicling the refugees. Everyone is making money off of the refugees except the refugees themselves, who are trapped there because of laws. And I want to ask you how your project breaks that.
Well, I think you're right that I can't change the way that the world works for refugees. I think that on balance, giving money to NGOs probably does some good. I think that concentrating at least half the money on smaller NGOs, and which are less likely to be bogged down in bureaucracy and in spending money on infrastructure and keeping themselves going, is important. But nothing's perfect, and I'm learning all the time from people like you and from other people I meet, and the whole thing's a journey. But I'm just trying to find a way to do it, and I will put a board together who will help advise me, because I'm not an expert in this area.
This has been so amazing speaking with you, and I want to, because it's such a complicated issue and you have such a large body of work, I want to open it to questions, and then if there aren't enough, I'll bother you more with my, with my questions. But who would like to ask Mark questions? And I'm only going to call on a woman first, so please, if you don't want us all to sit awkwardly here, I'd like to invite a woman to ask the first question.
Yeah, so my question was, as you said, that people are making money out of journalists or something. So don't you ever feel that being an artist portraying blood cube, which is an excellent idea, at times people might think that you are quite self-centered in art or making fame. So how do you deal with this entire question that are you just doing it for fame or you are really concerned?
Well, I mean, I can't convince people of my real concern except by doing things. I'm not making any money out of it. I've put already 3 or 4 years of my work into it and a lot of my own money into it. I believe that it will change things. I believe I think that it's only once the artwork actually exists and is in the public realm, which will be towards the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And the other thing is that this artwork, the idea is for it to tour the world, to keep touring the world, so that it's the reaction to it in different countries. It's the trying to create this debate in different countries. It's almost like a kind of, like a movement in some way. And I think that it's only once it starts that I'll know if it works or not, and if, on balance, it's been successful. I think that artists make art, and I think if I make art about the world, to me that makes it more interesting to me. I'm not interested in just painting like abstract art that seems to have no relevance to anything and that is bought by rich people and stuck on the wall. I think that art can be bigger than that and should be better than that, and should engage with the real world and real issues. But yet, it's not journalism. It's a different thing. And I think it has a unique way. Art has a unique way of talking about subjects that cuts through the news babble in some way. That is a different way and a different perspective.
Quinn, thank you very much. You have referred to classical sculptures which are limbless, which have been broken down at some stage, and you have spoken about the people who are born without limbs from their birth. But there is another dimension of a body of art or bodies of art which have been violated and which have been broken down or desecrated. Paintings and sculptures like the Pieta in the Vatican, all right, where noses or the sculptures in Mathura and Vrindavan, where temple sculptures have been broken consciously, all right, to make a statement, all right, a political or a religious statement. Isn't that another dimension that would interest you in creating a body of art?
Well, that is an interesting idea, which I haven't actually addressed. And yes, I think that the idea of desecrating an object to desecrate an idea is a very interesting one, which is, as you say, iconoclasm has an amazing history throughout the ages, and is always, I mean, in a way it shows the power of art, that people have the need to smash it and destroy it. And even, we see it now with ISIS in Iraq, where they were destroying Palmyra and Nineveh, and not only killing people, but smashing objects as well. And I think that it shows that art carries the cultural memory of a people. If your enemy wants to destroy it, if it had nothing to it, people would just ignore it.
Hi, good morning. The sight of blood is uncomfortable for many to view. So don't you think this medium would lose the wider appeal of engaging with people, of creating awareness? Many people wouldn't want to converse with art, with this cube, just because there's blood in it. Because many people, they are uncomfortable looking at blood. Thank you.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point you raise, and I think that art doesn't have to always function from the point of comfort. I think that art can disrupt you and disrupt I think it should disrupt your journey through the world. And that, I think it's that kind of visceral disruption where suddenly something hits you in the gut before it hits your head. then that stops you, and then often you think about things more deeply if you've been emotionally disturbed before you start thinking about the subject. So I'd say that that's a very good reason to use blood, because it kind of cuts through the bullshit.
Byzantine mosaics have lasted maybe 1,000 years. Are you concerned that the use of blood may not be so enduring, in the same way perhaps as Damien Hirst sharks and stuff may disintegrate?
I think that's part. I think the contingency of it. It's an interesting question, because you're right. Art is always about eternity, and I think that to make art that's about non-eternity, about, in a way, a continuous moment, it's a bit like the Zoroastrian flame that is kept in a temple for 1,000 years, but it's always a new fire. You have to keep putting wood on it. I think it demands more. It demands attention, and then if it does last, it's even more powerful. But also, it may not last, and it may end up being a memory, and it may end up in legend rather than in reality. But I think that it's a bit like a human being is alive for a certain amount of time, and that gives the human being a sort of reality that a table doesn't, which might last forever. So I think it kind of makes it feel more alive in some ways.
The world has become extremely polarized in last few years. If words and debates can't change people's minds, how do you think art can change people's mind about refugee crisis and
Sorry,
political
could you
beliefs?
speak into the mic? I didn't quite hear that.
The world has become extremely polarized in last few years, and it's heading more towards polarization in terms of political thoughts and beliefs. If there are debates and discussions not changing people's minds, how do you think art can change people's minds? As an artist myself, I want to know if there's hope.
Because I think that it sort of bypasses discussion and hits you emotionally and viscerally first, and then you think about it afterwards. So it's like a different angle, a different facet of the same subject in a way. But I think one that's underused for communication. And so by using something that people don't expect to see strong content within art, then I think that that's an element of surprise, and that element, and I think that's why it's important that it should be in public as well, because that's when you can engage with a whole new level of people. And you write books, that's an engagement with a whole level of people. Or you're saying you're doing a mural on a wall in Athens. These kind of things where people come across art in unexpected context. The 20th century started with Marcel Duchamp putting a urinal in a gallery with the idea that by taking the real world into the white room of art, you look at something differently, and that's absolutely true. But I would say that the next thing to do is take art out of the white cube and put it into the real world. So a kind of inversion of the Duchamp.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that one of the ways that artists have disempowered themselves is by confining themselves to the art world, and that art is way too big and way too engaged with the world for the art world to ever possibly contain it. And I think that the only way that art can be relevant is, as you said, to get out into the streets and to confront people, including people who deeply disagree with you, people who loathe you, people who think that you're, anti-national or a traitor to America or all sorts of other things. I think that for art to be locked up in some little safe space is the weakest and most marginal thing it can do.
It's like an animal in a zoo.
Exactly, a butterfly pinned to a wall.
Out. Yeah.
Exactly. So art has to confront, and I think, for me, that's the hope.
Yeah.
Are you at all concerned that art is becoming very strongly associated with weirdness?
with weirdness.
Weirdness.
Becoming.
I think one person's weirdness is another person's normality. And I think what's really interesting is that art can record how society evolves. And for instance, in the sculptures of transsexual people that I made in 2010, I was definitely accused of gratuitous weirdness then. And now the society has evolved in Western countries at least to the point where it's completely normal and it's part of how people think about the world. So I think quite often art anticipates where society is going to go.
It seems to me, though, that sometimes the motivation of the people that you're trying to communicate with... Can I just finish this thought? Or, yes, may I?
There's another woman at the front.
What's the problem? Can I finish this thought?
Right,
yeah, finish.
That you spoke about art, artifacts, and this notion of it being, like going to the zoo. Sometimes it seems to me that the reason why people look at contemporary art is pretty much the same. They go to it's like going to a circus to see weird things.
I think there's just so many, art is so many different things. Some of it may be seen as weird by some people, but some of it certainly isn't and is very accessible. I think that you can't really, I make art to try and understand the world, so I will find subjects that seem to be unresolved in my mind, and by making art about it, I'll try and feel what I think about it, I suppose, and connect to it. So I think that art is kind of concrete philosophy, and so it will inevitably deal with questions that are ambiguous and on the margin and contentious.
Associating art with history, in Berlin, I saw the Jewish Holocaust Memorial, and sometimes artists, they obscure what exactly the memorial itself is symbolizing. And I just wanted to wonder why an artist would leave such a thing open for interpretation, because it can be interpreted in so many different ways.
I think art always is. If you're making art that can only be interpreted in one way, that's called propaganda. And when you look at all the art that was made in Russia and China during the communist period, it's not that interesting as art. It's interesting as social comment and craft. But I think that the whole point of art is that it has to be ambiguous, that everyone has to be able to bring a part of themselves. Art is a mirror, and you bring yourself to it.
Hi, and this question is open to both of you all. In the conversation, you alluded to some of the, given the nature of your work, some of the constraints and challenges presented by the economy side of the art market. Could you talk about how you kind of negotiate those constraints and challenges that come with the economy of the art market?
Yeah, well, yeah, in order to make art, I have to keep on selling artworks. And so some things are more commercial and some things are less commercial, I suppose. And it's a question of balancing it or finding things. But also there are people who collect art because they're interested in it and they buy more challenging art as well. But if you want to make money in art, you just make beautiful things that have no content and then you'll do very well.
You could make highly polished spheres that you can put in lofts for oligarchs. I have a slightly different background than Mark in two things. First of all, I'm American, which has no art funding at all. We don't value, the American government does not value culture, sadly. The second thing, though, is that I don't sell my work to rich collectors. Not because of any sort of moral purity on my part, it's just not how my career went. And so for me, a lot of the way that I actually make a living is through doing journalism and also through doing illustration as well.
Mark, it's over 30 years now since Freeze and the birth of the YBA movement, and I just wondered how you feel about that title now and how you look at that mid-90s art scene with the benefit of hindsight.
Well, it's good to be called young when you're in your 50s. I like that. But basically, I think that it was an amazing time when a whole load of artists sort of started making art, and that it's a bit like a perfect storm. There was Saatchi, who had his museum, who was willing to show young, untested art. There was a recession, so art collectors didn't want to spend money. They wanted to buy cheap, young art. There was the legacy of punk, so people of my generation just thinking, fuck it, we're not just going to wait for some gallery to give us a show, we'll just do it ourselves. And there was this, all these things came together, and there was a big explosion. And I think there was a big explosion because, in a way, the defining thing about YBA art, I think, is bringing real life into art in different ways. And I think that hadn't been done quite as viscerally before. And I think that's I would say, the contribution that we've made, is that idea of bringing the real world into art. And then inevitably, as time changed, some artists continue making work, some don't. It's like the birth of a universe. You have all this cloud of gas, and you don't really know what's happening, and then it solidifies into different things afterwards.
I think we have time for one more question, a brief question. Over here.
Hi, just a question from a Philistine. Does Banksy fit into all this? Because he seems great at bringing attention to all sorts of quite dubious stuff that goes on in the world.
Yeah, well, I think Banksy is an example of a contemporary artist who works in the medium of public space in a really strong way. So yeah, I think that he's someone who's started in that realm and has then used it, like Molly, to bring content to the public realm as well, and not just to put like tags. I mean, in a way, in graffiti, you start with people just writing their name, and then you have artists who start to bring content into it, and that's like Molly and like Banksy, and those people change how people think. So I think it's all part of the same movement towards the idea of content in the public realm having a role.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this amazing conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you to Jaipur, and thank you to all of you for the wonderful questions.
Thanks.